I've mentioned previously that there was never any plan for any overarching narrative for this project. No MacGuffin, no pantomime villain that would end up tying up all the storylines. The original plan was to have each story presented via an intelligence report that was being given back by various sources to a specialist unit in the British military. Those reports would have come from a variety of sources: German POWs, RAF pilots who'd gone off to an attachment in Russia, the American OSS. The issue with this was that some of the stories that I'd written didn't end up naturally lending themselves to survivor stories or witnesses. And it was actually becoming harder to try and map out how the story would have made it back to this unit than writing the story itself. I've managed to retain a bit of that in the testimonials that I've been doing between the episodes. There's the inference that Major Elliot has been specifically detailed to brief a certain minister on a thin sliver of intel reports that all pertain to the supernatural. Regardless, it was always my intention to have recurring characters, at least for some of the stories, if only to tie them together or to set up sequels. Stanley Shepherd, for example, was always going to pop up somewhere in the future, most likely leading a British response to the Atlantean threat. Lucius, as I've referenced before, just kind of took on a life of his own. I think because you've got this vast and rolling past to work from because of his immortality and a future that he could have, it just makes it really easy to find stories for him. Gerhard Haas just kind of grew on me a little bit. The intention when I wrote Covenant was always to have Sergeant Linz crop up again in the future. Spoiler alert, he will. But I like the idea that there's this reason that Haas is just so easygoing about the fact that there's a demon flying around the French countryside killing his men. And after Krauss has been moved out of the way, Haas just steps up. He's just a quiet guy in the background and a safe pair of hands. I actually rewrote the script a little bit when I redid the episode because the audio for the original was so poor, to reflect the fact that he deliberately references to the Frenchman he's speaking to that he's already experienced weird things during the war. The fact the war only lasted 6 years meant that I didn't have a lot of backstory to work with, particularly as Covenant takes place in 1942. So the reality was, I didn't have a massive list of engagements to pick for him. But the possibility of building up a pre-existing relationship between him and Linz opened the door to arguably the greatest victory that the Fallschirmjäger had during World War II, which was Eben-Emael. The Belgian army had spent 3 years building a fort at Eben-Emael, and they'd already spent several years prior to that fortifying the Albert Canal and all the land around it. The fort was an expansion and improvement of the same defensive line they'd used against the Germans in World War I, and it was designed to be virtually impregnable to any attacking army. It was the biggest military fort of its era. It had 4 kilometres of underground tunnels beneath it, which meant that the defenders could move around freely without fear of enemy artillery barrage. With the majority of the fort hidden underground, what you had above ground was essentially a flat roof, crisscrossed with machine gun posts, 60 and 70mm guns, and with a pair of massive 120mm guns in the middle. The fort could pretty much land down a barrage anywhere within a 15-mile circuit around it, and this covered all the key roads that led into the country from the neighbouring Dutch border. And it could also comfortably house a force of up to 1,200 men, all with the design that any army that came in would be stalled and there'd be an immediate counterattack. Knowing that even with tanks, they couldn't win in a direct attack against the fort, the Germans reasoned that if they could neutralise the guns, then the rest of the fort could just be bypassed and left where it was. On the early hours of 10th May 1940, a force of 42 gliders took off, intending to deposit paratroopers armed with flamethrowers and explosives onto the fort roof but also to hold the bridges around the fort to allow a relief force to get there. They landed on the roof and caught the defenders completely by surprise, and then with assistance from Stuka dive bombers, the paratroopers were able to capture the fort within a few hours, only sustaining 6 fatalities. The Belgian defenders were stunned from the explosions that took place on the turrets, retreated below ground, and after losing 60 dead, reasoned they were being attacked by a much larger force and surrendered, meaning that the Germans had captured 1,000 Belgians for the loss of 6 men. There's virtually no detail available online for who took over the fort when the paratroopers were finished, so the inclusion of the 148th Reserve Division and their officers is completely fictional on my part. Members of this unit did fight in Belgium and in France. They ended the war fighting in Italy, which is why they're referenced at the end of Border, one of the short stories that we've done. My initial idea was that they'd end up facing off against a lone Belgian soldier who also happened to be a werewolf. But I do like to try and stick to the realistic side of the line. So rather than lycanthropy, I was drawn to a script I'd written for bedtime stories. One of the reasons I'm not quite as right as I am is that I watched a lot of foreign horror movies when I was a kid, and Brotherhood of the Wolf was one of my favourites. It's based directly on the legend of the Beast of Gévaudan and features French aristocrats breeding super wolves, which they then armour and mock up to look like monsters in order to keep their peasants in line. The reality is, nobody really knows the true origin of the Beast of Gévaudan, the monster that terrorised rural France during the 1760s. It was likely a hybrid, and that would have been a result of cross-species breeding, either intentional or unintentional. So it seemed far more fun to me to have a lone Belgian misfit who'd spent decades breeding a super wolf he could control, rather than have him morphing into a werewolf. And it also allowed me the opportunity to maybe go back, do his backstory and the wolf's backstory, which is where I'm hoping the next episode will go. In terms of the channel moving forwards, there's a couple of things I've got planned for the new year. Mikey is going to be working on the art for an episode set in Stalingrad, which is going to have a zombie Soviet army in it. I know I said I wouldn't do zombies, but, it's my channel. Sean is also finally going to get his chance to get his hands on Bez, and that features a Russian demon hunting partisans through the countryside around Murmansk. There's sequel stories planned for the Atlanteans and for the Wendigo. Wendigo. And also a cameo appearance for one of the most charismatic and notorious characters of World War II, Otto Skutzany. Anyway, I know I always say it, but I'm going to say it again. Thank you for supporting the channel, particularly with times as tough as they are right now. I genuinely and sincerely hope things aren't too hard on you guys right now. And I, for one, am looking forward to seeing us all come to the other side and see each other there. So thanks again, guys, and I'll see you soon.